Muy buenas tardes,
Good
primero que todo.
afternoon. First of all,
Muchas gracias por su
thank you very much
atención.
for your attention.
Quería
I
primero
would like to
preguntarles,
ask
¿quién de
first,
ustedes es
which one
ingeniero?
of you is an engineer?
Bastantes ingenieros. ¿Y de
I
esos
see
quiénes son
there are many
mecánicos o
engineers.
electricistas?
And how many of those are
Ok,
mechanical
muy
engineers
bien.
or electric
Eh,
engineers?
para dar la justificación de la
Okay,
pregunta y del
as
tema
a
en general,
justification for
me
this
refería a
question
esa
and the
pregunta
general
porque
topic,
la presentación
the presentation,
lo que quiere lograr al
what
final de cuentas es
it
presentar una
intends to
serie de
do is
aspectos
present a
técnicos
series of
que dependiendo
technical
del
aspects
background que
that,
tengamos,
depending on the
muchas
background,
veces puede ser trivial para
can be
nosotros
maybe
y
trivial,
en muchos otros
depending
casos
on our background,
no precisamente
or
puede
in
ser
other
trivial
cases,
para que al
maybe not
final de
so
cuentas
trivial.
veamos
So at the end of the
y
day, we
conozcamos
can look
esa
at
serie de
and know
aspectos o
the
de
series of
parámetros y de
aspects and
variables que nos
parameters
van a
and that
facilitar o nos van a
will
permitir tomar algunas
facilitate
decisiones
to take
en el
some
ámbito de la
decisions
energía
in
cuando
the
administramos una oficina.
energy efficacy
Vamos a ver
department. We'll see
algunos aspectos
some of
teóricos
the
y al
theoretical
final la
aspects,
idea es
and at the
presentarles
end, the idea is to present
un ejemplo
an
específico
example, a specific
muy
example,
sencillo. Es
very
algo
simple.
verdaderamente
It's
que se hizo
something
en un
that's
día. Es un
really that
ejemplo
was done in one day,
aplicado
and it's an
que se
applied
hizo
example
súper rápido, súper
that was
sencillo,
very quick,
pero
very simple.
para que al final ustedes
But
vean que
so
a
that
veces
at the
aplicando
end,
cosas muy
you can
sencillas
see that
nos puede dar
applying
resultados que a la
simple things,
larga
we can obtain
pueden resultar
good results or
interesantes
interesting
y que
results,
sumados unos con otros nos
and
puede
which,
dar un resultado
added up,
favorable
can
a
give
largo
a
plazo.
favorable result in the long
Entonces,
term.
procedo.
So I'll proceed.
Para hablarles un poco los factores que
To
influyen
talk about
en
the
el consumo
factors
de energía
that
en un edificio,
influence
les quería presentar
energy spending in an influence,
y bueno, primero que
in a
todo,
building.
muchas de las fuentes
First
que
of all,
utilizo
many of the sources I
son
use
europeas. Yo
are
no soy
European.
conocedor
I'm not
del
very
ámbito europeo,
knowledgeable
yo soy
about the
más
European region.
occidental, por supuesto.
I'm more Western,
Sin
of course.
embargo, por
Nonetheless,
tratarse de este lugar, traté
because
de
it's this
buscar alguna
place, Madrid,
información que
I
fuera
was
referente
trying
a
to find some
España o
information
Occidente.
that could
Entonces, por
refer to
ejemplo,
Spain.
en el gráfico de
So, for
arriba
example, in
se
the
muestra
graphic
cómo es una
above,
distribución
we
de
can see the
consumos en
distribution
una oficina
of
típica
consumption
en
in a
España, en
typical
donde tenemos
Spanish
la
office
parte
building,
azul de
where we have
iluminación y
the blue
equipos,
part, which
la
is
parte roja
basically illumination,
calefacción, la
red
parte
is
verde
heating,
refrigeración
green is
el
refrigeration,
pequeño
and the
sección ahí
small
que
section
es
up there
agua caliente,
is basically
básicamente.
hot
Bueno, yo
water.
vivo en un país tropical y
I
para
live in
mí
a
que me
tropical
hablen
country,
de agua caliente
and
es un lujo,
hearing
¿verdad?
about
Yo tengo agua
hot
caliente
water
en
is a
casa.
luxury.
Todos
I
tenemos
have
agua caliente en la casa, pero en la oficina
hot
no,
water
es
at
un lujo.
home, but not in the
Igual
office.
la
It's a
calefacción,
luxury.
o sea, no,
And the same thing
la
applies
pongo
to
y nunca
heating.
la uso, ¿verdad?
We never use heating.
Entonces, vamos al grafiquito
So
pequeño
we
de
go to
abajo
the
y
small
vemos que
graphic
para una oficina
below,
típica
and
en
we see that
Costa
for a
Rica, y
typical
específicamente el
office
edificio
in
corporativo
Costa
de
Rica,
Chiquita Brands, que queda en San José,
for example, in
tenemos una
Chiquita branch
distribución
in
de
San
ese
Jose,
tipo, un poco más
we have
sencilla, en
this
donde la
kind of
porción más
distribution
grande,
where the
color
biggest portion,
rosado, es
the
el
pink
aire
colored one,
acondicionado.
is air
Ahí
conditioning.
sí, vamos
There you can see it.
estamos en un país
We're in
donde
a
hace mucho calor y
hot
hay
country
mucha humedad.
and
El
very
consumo de
humid,
aire
of course.
acondicionado es
So
verdaderamente
air
importante.
conditioning
La
consumption is,
parte
of course,
celeste,
important.
que es la
The
iluminación,
light blue
y la
part is
parte
illumination,
amarilla, que
and the
son los
yellow
equipos
part
en general.
are
Obviamente,
general equipment.
cabe mencionar que eso es una distribución
It bears
típica
mentioning
de
that
una
this is a
oficina,
typical
pero no quiere
distribution
decir
in an
que
office,
se
but it
vaya a
doesn't mean
comportar
that
así
it
para
has
todos los
to
casos.
be
¿Qué
this way
influye en este
for
tipo de
all of the
consumos?
cases.
Bueno, hay muchas
So what
cosas que
influences this
influyen.
kind of
Como
consumption?
sabemos,
There are many
tiene que ver
factors.
con el comportamiento humano, si
It
las
has to do with
personas
human
están
behavior.
utilizando bien los
If
recursos, si están
persons are
apagando la luz
using their
cuando
sources
salen, si
appropriately, if
están
they're
dejando el aire
switching off the
acondicionado
lights,
encendido
or
o
if they're
apagado.
using the
La
air
ocupación
conditioning.
tiene que ver con cuánta gente hay en la
And
oficina. Si hay una
occupation
distribución
depends on the
adecuada
quantity of people occupying
del
the
personal
office.
en el espacio de trabajo,
So
o sea,
the
más bien hay una
distribution of
sobredensidad
personnel
de población en ese
in the
espacio
office
de
space.
trabajo. La luz natural.
Natural
Ahí
light.
los arquitectos son expertos ahora en crear
Architectures are
espacios
experts
abiertos,
in
módulos
creating
con
open
paneles
spaces
bajos,
or
entradas
modules with
laterales de luz,
entries
con
for
amplios,
natural light,
vidrios
with
para el aprovechamiento
big
de esa luz
windows.
natural. Tiene
Just-
mucho que ver el estado del edificio. Si el edificio
The
se le
state
da
of the
poco
building is also
mantenimiento
interesting.
y-
The maintenance of the
y hay
building
muchas cosas que están
is
fallando,
very influential.
probablemente va a ser
If it's an old
va a
and
aumentar
badly
ese
maintained
consumo.
building, the
Los
consumption
controles y las
will
regulaciones
increase.
que hagamos, si
Controls
tenemos
and
sensores,
regulations.
para el control de
For
el
example,
apagado
if
y
we have
encendido de las luces,
sensors
si
that
tenemos
control
controles
the
automatizados
lights
para el aire
or
acondicionado,
for air
con
conditioning.
horarios, etcétera. La distribución del espacio que antes les
Also,
decía,
the distribution
cómo
of
estamos
space that I
acomodando
mentioned
al
before,
personal,
how
si
we're
está de
accommodating
acuerdo
staff,
con
if
cómo se
they're
distribuyó el aire acondicionado. Muchas veces
comfortable with how the air
sucede
conditioning
que
was distributed.
se diseña
Often
una distribución
we design
específica de
a
aire
specific
acondicionado,
distribution
la
in
oficina
regards to air
cambia, pero
conditioning,
no cambia la distribución de
and
aire
maybe the
acondicionado.
office
Entonces
changes,
estamos
but not the air
simplemente
conditioning distribution, so
desperdiciando
we're really
el aire
wasting
acondicionado
air
y
conditioning
aumentando las quejas
and
de la
increasing
población porque tal vez estamos hacinando
the
gente
demands of the
en un
population.
espacio donde el aire acondicionado se diseñó para un espacio
The air
con
conditioning
muchísimo
system
menos
could have been
personas.
designed for
Y,
a building with less
y
people,
los equipos instalados que tengamos, por
and
supuesto.
the installed equipment we have, of course.
En la mayoría de los países,
In the majority of
y es
countries,
el caso de mi país,
and this is the
se
case of my
cobra
country,
la tarifa eléctrica industrial,
we have
se
to
cobra
pay
la energía
the
tanto como la
industrial
demanda.
energy rate,
Yo le decía
also the demand.
unos compañeros que trataban
I was
de
telling to
entender
some
cómo era
colleagues that
el
were
tema
trying to
de la energía y la
understand
demanda,
how
y yo les digo,
the
bueno,
energy and demand
eso es como
topic
cuando vas
was
a McDonald's.
working
Si
in
te
Mexico.
cobran,
I gave them the example of
$1
McDonald's.
por comprar una hamburguesa,
If you pay
pues,
$1 for a
si vas a
hamburger,
mediodía a comprar
if
esa
you
hamburguesa, te
go
van a
at
cobrar
noon,
$1, pero te van a cobrar $3
it could be
más
the
por
double,
comprar la
or
hamburguesa
it could be
a
$3
mediodía,
more if you
porque es el
buy
momento
it
en donde
at noon,
más ocupados
because
están los empleados
it's
y más
when
difícil va a ser
there's
hacer
the
esa
maximum
hamburguesa.
influx of clients
Entonces,
and where
es lo
it's most
mismo que
difficult
pasa con la
to
energía.
produce that
Estamos pagando
hamburger, and it's
la
the same with
energía, pero en
energy.
los picos de
We're
mayor
paying the energy,
consumo, que
but when we have the
normalmente
peaks
son,
with the
las horas
most
de
consumption,
preparación de los
which are
alimentos o
usually the
mediodía,
hours around
es
noon,
donde la energía,
is where the energy
la demanda
and
sufre un
demand
pico y
suffers a
normalmente
peak.
lo que tenemos que buscar es
And
cómo
what we
aplanar
have
esa
to look
curva
is how to
y buscar
flatten
mover
that
los
curve
consumos hacia
and try
lados,
to move
hacia
consumption
sectores de la
to
curva,
other sectors of the
donde
curve
haya menos consumo.
where there is less consumption.
A mí me interesó mucho ese gráfico.
I was
el
very
de
interested
la
in that
mano
graphic
derecha.
in the right side
También
of
lo
the screen.
tomé de alguna fuente
I also
brasileña,
took it from a
donde
Brazilian source,
la distribución de la
where the
demanda, que es
distribution
la
of
línea
demand,
azul,
which is the blue line,
es de un día típico,
is of a typical day,
a partir de cierta hora ustedes
which
ven que crece y se
starting at
mantiene
a
en un
specific
punto
time
hasta el final del
grows
periodo
and maintains
monitoreado.
a
Y la línea
plateau,
amarilla la
and
tomaron
the yellow
el día
line,
que jugó Brasil, Portugal
which
en el Mundial.
was
Entonces,
taken the day
sucede
that
que el
Brazil
día que
played
en
against
el momento en
Portugal
que comenzó el partido,
in the
bajó
World
la
Cup.
demanda,
So we see that
terminó el
when
primer tiempo y
the
todo el mundo se
game
fue a hacer
started,
sus
demand
boquitas, sus palomitas de
dropped,
maíz, creció un
and
poquito,
in
volvió a
the
bajar, y cuando terminó el
halftime,
partido, todo el mundo ya se fue a hacer sus
there was a
actividades.
spike, and after the game there was also
Simplemente
another
como un
spike.
dato ilustrativo y curioso.
It's an curious data.
Quisiera hablarles de
I would like to
optimización
talk about
de la
optimization
eficiencia
of
energética,
electrical
que es
efficiency,
lo que buscamos hacer,
which
bueno,
is what we
buscar acciones
try to
que
do,
precisamente
find actions that
logren bajar este consumo
can
eléctrico
lower
sin
electric
perjudicar a la
consumption
larga los
without
niveles de confort o la
damaging
satisfacción del cliente final.
damaging
O sea,
comfort
no se
levels of
trata,
the
al
client.
final de cuentas, de ver cómo ahorramos sin
In the
control,
end, it's
sino tener
just not only to see how we can save, but have technical criteria to apply these measures without damaging the levels of satisfaction. We can take operational measures or technological measures. One of the operational measures is basically starting at 10 p.m., we're going to turn off the air conditioning. This is how we're going to operate. So if someone works after 10 p.m., he won't have air conditioning, as an example. And the technological measure could be replacing equipment. We're not going to use old-fashioned lamps, but new technology that reduces consumption. We're going to talk a little bit about the illumination systems. Basically, for those of you who aren't so familiar with illumination systems, I would like to present to you the three concepts: lumen, lux, and color temperature. Lumen is a capacity for a light bulb or a fluorescent tube, how much light it is to emit. Lux is a quantity of lighting that at a certain point in time we are receiving. When you have an illuminated space, we have more look-see than other spaces that have shades. So I have a larger satisfaction for my task when I have a higher quantity of looks. We also have to know this parameter. We want to have as many looks as we can, because there could be also problems when there's too much illumination and lighting. It would be more costly. And color temperature, it's the lighting tone that we can see. We have various examples on the screen. Sometimes the light is slightly yellowish. We say that's warm light. And sometimes it's more whitish or bluish, or we say it's a cold light. And we use this for different types of lighting. We have the concept of luminous efficacy. It's also important because the term efficacy is different from efficiency. Efficiency says that what we can receive from an equipment potentially compared to what it really wastes. So we are going to know how many lumens we can have in the efficacy. The higher the light, the lumens, the lower the cost. And the chromatic reproduction index, which will tell us the capacity of that equipment to reproduce colors as in reality. We have 3 examples, as you can see. For example, an incandescent light bulb gives us almost perfect lighting indexes. This is simply a table where the provider can give us information of how much power a light bulb needs and how many lumens it emits. For example, it could be also an incandescent light bulb. We say, for example, a tube could have 2 watts, but if you compare 2 tubes with 32 watts, they will have different efficacy depending on the lumens. It's also important to recognize what the lifespan of the equipment will have. It's how much time that equipment will function without degenerating and devolving to lower numbers of lumens. This type of information is necessary to know, just to be able to make decisions as to which piece of equipment is the best, what replacement periods we should take into account. So, for example, when a light bulb, I have to tell you now, I can't tell you the best strategy because it depends on the type of space you're lighting. It depends on the size of the office, the cost that you might have, or the budget, maintenance staff that you might have. But based on this type of things, you can make decisions, and sometimes it's interesting because you make some decisions, for example, like where you replace all of the light bulbs in a building yearly because it's cheaper to do it one round across the building and change all light bulbs instead of doing it for specific light bulbs each time. For a specific example, precisely a month ago or so, an employee who supports us in reception, he said that every time the light bulb doesn't work, I have to pay maybe around $500 just to change the light bulb that maybe costs $20. And I did this last month, and I'm doing it this month again. When the lifespan of these light bulbs is usually pretty long, So why not construe this scaffold to change them, all of them, so you can have insurance that the next time you're going to change them all is going to be in 4 or 5 months. But those $500 you invested on that scaffold is going to be more or less equivalent to the 5 light bulbs you're going to exchange. So I get a bit forward, ahead of myself with maintenance, but what kind of things? Often we think that lighting systems don't need maintenance, but light bulbs and reflectors, the fluorescent tubes, usually get dirty. They can accumulate dust. They should be cleaned. A lot of times their luminous flux is reduced. Often it's still operational, but you can see black spots on the tube or the bulb. And later we're going to look at a graph that tells us that the equipment is functional, but it's not giving the adequate parameters for that device. So often it's a lot more beneficial to change it instead of when the efficacy of that this device will reduce itself considerably. Rule 660, I didn't know it before I came here. When I was doing my research, I know the regulations in my country. I applied it on the example I'm going to explain. I'd never heard about this one previously, and I investigated. This is the rule that the European Union uses. It's about a 50-page book, but it specifies the amount of lighting for certain workspaces. So I can tell you that a key number that was used in the example is 500 lux for an office space covering a desk, and 200, 300 lux for an office space that could be a hallway or somewhere where the employee can walk from one place to another. Those were the 2 numbers that were juggled for this specific example. We have some indicators. Which ones are excellent or which ones are good? Or there are temperature ranges also, when it's cold, hot, or neutral. But maybe at this point in time it's not as relevant to the example. That's only the lighting part. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about air conditioning. As I said, in tropical regions, it's a little bit more complicated in this area, because as most of you know, and I don't know as much, winters, you need heat sources for the winter. That doesn't happen in my country. It simply is the air conditioning matter. So I will only talk about air conditioning, which is also in the example. So what aspects should we take into account to make decisions in concerns to reduction of air conditioning consumption? Open doors, of course, windows, holes in walls, any kind of loss of refrigeration. We're using the most efficient equipment. Technology is advancing, and we're getting more and more efficient equipment. But old equipment can start losing efficiency. So there comes a certain point where you have to take the decision of changing the equipment, and it will impact the budget in terms of costs, and where we can get a reinvestment depending on the savings on the consumption. Apart from that, this research and these technological advances are also giving us refrigerants that might be more environmentally friendly. Operational control, how we are operating our equipment, if we're turning them off or on, or if we are allowing access to anybody, or if they only have a single operator, if it has schedules. Sometimes we have programmable thermostats, or we have the maintenance personnel who have to switch them off and on at certain points in time. And adequate maintenance. I really like this one. I imagine that this happens everywhere, because even the ASHRAE recommends it. When there are more men than women, air conditioning should be a little bit higher than when it's the other way around. This means that the need for refrigeration for a man is different than for a woman. And this happens with different people too. People with maybe a little bit more fat in their bodies. In the end, the person will influence a lot how comfortable they will feel inside the workspace, and what the required temperature could be for that person to achieve comfort. And they've asked us, what temperature should the air conditioning be at? Does anybody know what the ideal temperature is for AC? 24 degrees. Well, that's a question that I get a lot. The temperature for air conditioning? 24 is an excellent number. And it's precisely, I insist with the example, but it's precisely part of what we're going to see in the example. We'll look at this graph, and we can see what the comfort zone is. This was invented by a Hungarian architect, but it also has technical support from SRAE. They also have a rule that gives us a series of parameters to define that comfort zone. Precisely, that graph tells us, well, that the comfort zone isn't a point. It's not 23 degrees or 24 degrees. It's a zone. And it depends a lot on humidity. It depends also on the speed of the air. It's different when we're feeling that temperature at fast air or slower air. We have a constant air speed, and we can feel that, and also in the exterior. So it depends on that. It also has to do with solar radiation. And so these lines where you can see temperature is the solar radiation that we have. The last line, it's around 20 degrees. That's more or less the temperature under the shade. So we can manage in that comfort zone. Yeah, 24 is a good number based on humidity, on speed, a normal airspeed, based on many things. But we will always have a percentage of people who are not going to be comfortable with that temperature, because it has a lot to do with the humidity, with the type of clothing we were wearing, or the activity that we're realizing. It has to do with airspeed, as I mentioned before, and temperature of objects and walls. It's also curious. I'll tell you a little anecdote. To me, it's curious because often they tell me, please lower the air conditioning temperature. And I say, yeah, okay, I already did. 15 minutes later. and I really haven't done it. So what happens? People are usually very hot because of he was running down the stairs, and it was 22 degrees Celsius, which is a comfort zone. But the man felt that air conditioning wasn't working. All we had to do was just simply wait till the heat started to let the physics do its task. Types of air conditioning. You have many different types of air conditioning. I would like to describe three. Direct expansion, which is cooled with water, and direct expansion that's cooled with air. And then we have ice water. We're going to talk about the type of direct expansion cooled with air. That's where we have a refrigeration cycle, where inside the space we have an evaporator, which gives us cold, and outside we have a system, a condensating system with a compressor that eliminates heat. And the compressor will do the task according to the thermostat we have and the temperature that we're telling it to. When we say 24 degrees, if it's hotter, the thermostat will start operating, and when it reaches 24, it will stop. And it will always be a cycle trying to reach that equilibrium. This is what I was telling you about. This is called a mini split. This is the type of condenser by direct expansion with a condenser outside, steer condenser. And in this graphic, where we can see the comparison, this part is called thermic inertia, where we see the compressor equipment starting up. In the graph, the gray graph below, you can see a compressor that's starting and stopping, starting and stopping. It's with long cycles. And if you look at the smaller and more efficient system, it's not as, the cycles aren't that long, and stability is maintained. And maybe the compressor is still operating, or it has simply starts up fewer times. And these are some of the indicators we can use to measure or to benchmarking or comparing with other sites. If we had many buildings under our administration and we want to compare the efficiency, or depending on the tonnage we're using per square meter or wattage per square meter. It's not a design parameter. It's simply getting to know what the tonnage that we have installed in our places is. For example, a typical value is 0.04 tons per square meter. Doesn't mean that that number we can use it to design an air conditioning system. There shouldn't be any misunderstandings about that. Okay, an important part, maintenance management. What is the adequate maintenance for air conditioning? I would also like to insist on this because on this depends the operation of the equipment and which parameters it should be working in. For example, one of these filters is to increase the voltage of the motor to make it work more, and also increasing the consumption. And the same happens with dirty equipment. We have an increase in heat because there's loss of isolation. So we're reducing equipment efficiency because we're increasing heat. because it loses efficiency. And in the recommended periods, we're measuring the voltage parameters and refrigerating pressure parameters, which will indicate, in the case of the refrigerator, if the equipment has sufficient amount of refrigerator, so that to ensure that it works inside the parameters that we've established. And the same thing happens with electrical measurements. And we assure ourselves a tendency, a trend. If we increase the consumption of a motor, as I said, it could have to do with a filter that's dirty or a damaged motor, etc., etc. Okay, 2 more minutes. I have this example. This graph shows us that for different lightings, we have different behavior. For example, let's look at the third one, which is more or less a purple color, which is fluorescent. And it tells us the behavior of this fluorescent in time. And on the other side, we see the capacity of that device to give us the values that the producer would assure. After 20,000 hours or even 18,000 hours, there's a big drop and it's very probable that after 18,000 hours, it's still consuming 32 watts, but performing a lot less, maybe even a third less. A good decision based on this could be that useful lifespan, we want to change the totality of devices. This isn't set in stone. It's not valid for all circumstances. It's simply something that we can do based on an analysis, financial analysis that we'll elaborate ourselves, and that will depend solely on the conditions of the real estate that we're considering. We did cleaning of tubes. We measured luminescence, and we identified signs of premature deterioration in the tubes, and we changed these tubes, and in the zones where there was high levels of illumination, we simply removed them. And the lamps that were made for 3 tubes were left with only 2 or 1, assuring that in all of them, all of these spaces, there was sufficient quantity of lumens for the required conditions. And as to air conditioning, what we did was regulate established temperature that was 24 degrees Celsius. What happens when we have 2 types of varieties? We would leave it on for the whole work period, so there would be a sensation of freshness because of the constant increase in airspeed, and so that staff wouldn't be in need of very low temperatures. And this gives us the opportunity to have less startups for the compressor. And to summarize this, to achieve better thermic sensation and eliminating 200 tubes and more or less $48,000 saved, plus costs for exchange. And you can see it's a small project, but I'd like to emphasize that there are small opportunities that are available and that can give good results at an economic level. Thank you very much.